It was music history's best-kept secret. No cameras, no tape recorders, no press. On the night of August 27, 1965, the four most famous people on the planet entered a fortress in Bel Air to meet the only person in the universe who was bigger than them. What was supposed to be a party began with a terrifying, almost unbearable silence. The Beatles, the owners of the world, trembled. And the king, he was about to kick them all out of his living room. What actually happened behind those closed doors defined the future of rock, but left scars that were never fully explained. Forget the fairy tale. This is the anatomy of the strangest, tensest, and most legendary meeting in pop culture. To understand the true magnitude of what happened on the night of August 27, 1965, we first need to understand that this wasn't just a social gathering between famous musicians. It was the climax of a cultural collision course that had been taking shape for at least 2 years. In one corner of the ring was the uncontrollable force of the British invasion, and in the other, the insurmountable wall of the American dream personified in a single man. For anyone studying rock history, this moment is the equivalent of the Big Bang, but the details leading up to the knock on the door of that Bel Air mansion are just as fascinating as the meeting itself. The year 1965 was strange and dangerous territory for Elvis Presley. It is crucial for fans to understand the king's psychology at that specific moment. While the world outside was changing color and getting louder with Beatlemania, Elvis felt trapped in a gilded cage built by Hollywood. He was in the middle of exhausting film contracts, making movies like Paradise Hawaiian Style, which, let's be honest, were far removed from the raw, revolutionary energy he presented to the world in 1956. Elvis knew this. He was an artist with sharp instincts, and he felt his crown was being contested. He looked at the charts and saw those four lads from Liverpool dominating everything, using the musical vocabulary he himself had created. Therefore, for Elvis, receiving the Beatles wasn't just opening the door for fans, it was measuring strength with the only entity on the planet that could, in theory, look him in the eye as an equal.
On the other side of town, the atmosphere was one of reverent panic. The Beatles weren't just fans of Elvis, they were fanatical disciples. John Lennon, the most cynical and sharp mind of his generation, stripped himself of all his arrogance when the subject was Elvis Presley. He repeated numerous times to anyone who would listen that before Elvis, there was nothing. The idea of meeting the man who basically drew the map of their lives left the four lads terrified. They were staying in Los Angeles, playing the Hollywood Bowl, living the height of global adoration, but inside that bubble, they reverted to being insecure teenagers from Liverpool about to meet a deity. The backstage of this negotiation was a drama in itself, starring two of the industry's most complex figures, Brian Epstein and Colonel Tom Parker. Brian, the refined gentleman who managed the Beatles, had been trying to organize this diplomatic meeting for a long time, but he underestimated the Colonel's cunning and power plays. Parker knew Elvis was the ultimate prize. He used this meeting to reaffirm the hierarchy of show business. He made it clear that if the Beatles, the hottest band of the moment, wanted to see Elvis, they would have to come to him. There would be no meeting on neutral ground. The king does not travel to see subjects. The subjects travel to pay homage to the king. It was a masterstroke by the colonel to show who still held the keys to the kingdom. Furthermore, the conditions imposed by Colonel Parker created the aura of mystery that endures to this day. He decreed the law of visual silence, no press, no audio recording, and tragically for history, no photography. The colonel knew that a photo of the Beatles and Elvis together would be worth millions, and he wasn't willing to give that image to the world for free, nor let the Beatles image suck the vitality out of Elvis on newspaper covers. This decision transformed the event into a myth. Everything we know today comes from the fragmented memories of those who were there, which makes the narrative even richer and full of fascinating contradictions.
When the night finally arrived, the Beatles' caravan departed from their rented house in Benedict Canyon. The journey was tense. The Colonel, in another one of his publicity maneuvers, ensured that information about the meeting location was leaked to select fan clubs. He wanted the Beatles to see that, even in 1965, the streets still filled up for Elvis Presley. When the black limousines turned the corner of Perugia Way, number 525, a mansion rented by Elvis while filming, the street was packed. It wasn't Graceland, but that night, that house in Bel Air became the center of the universe. Inside the cars, the Beatles' anxiety was palpable. Reports from those close to them, like press officer Tony Barrow, say that the silence inside the car was broken only by nervous jokes. They didn't know which version of Elvis they would encounter. Would it be the rebellious rocker, the polished movie star? They were about to enter the lion's den, surrounded by the infamous Memphis Mafia, Elvis's loyal friends and protectors who formed an impenetrable human barrier around the star. Upon reaching the gate, security was presidential level. The Memphis Mafia was at their posts. Jerry Schilling, Marty Lacker, Joe Esposito, all of Elvis's trusted men were there, not just as friends, but as guardians. For them, the Beatles were curious visitors, but Elvis was family, the boss, the man who put food on everyone's table. There was a very strong sense of territorial protection. They knew the outside world was saying Elvis's time had passed, and that night was the chance to prove, inside those walls, that the magic was still alive. When the car engines were turned off and the doors opened, the California air seemed heavier. The four lads stepped out, straightened their clothes, and walked toward the front door, unaware they were seconds away from experiencing the most deafening silence of their lives. History was about to be written, not with ink, but with glances, tension, and eventually, music. As soon as the four lads from Liverpool crossed the threshold of that Bel Air mansion, the clock seemed to stop. It was 10 at night, but inside that circular living room, time didn't exist. The atmosphere the Beatles found upon entering wasn't that of a wild Hollywood party, nor a formal diplomatic reception. What they found was a domestic sanctuary, strangely silent and intimidating. The lighting was low, designed for relaxation, and in the center of that private universe was Elvis Presley. He was sitting on a large L-shaped couch, wearing a vibrant red shirt and tight gray slacks, an image that contrasted with the formality of the suits the world expected. The television was on, but soundless, casting a ghostly blue light over the king's face as his fingers absent-mindedly ran over the strings of a Fender bass. The moment that followed the Beatles' entrance is undoubtedly one of the most agonizing and fascinating in pop culture history. It was the Great Freeze. John, Paul, George, and Ringo, men who were used to having the world at their feet, who faced crowds of 50,000 people without blinking, simply froze. They lined up in front of Elvis like schoolboys called to the principal's office, or like believers before an altar, unable to formulate a coherent sentence. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a heavy physical presence in the room. Priscilla Presley, who was watching everything discreetly from a corner, wearing her checkered dress and a small tiara, reported years later that you could hear people breathing and the muffled sound of feet on the carpet. For Elvis, that mute adoration was uncomfortable. He didn't want to be treated like a wax statue in his own home. He was a man of action, a visceral artist who despised pretension. He looked at those four British musicians staring at him with wide eyes and realized that idolatry was killing the spontaneity. It was at that instant that Elvis's charismatic personality saved the night from total disaster. With a smirk, he broke the tension with disarming frankness, saying that if they were just going to sit there staring at his face all night, he was going to go to bed. He said he hoped they could talk a little and maybe play some music. And here I need to take a quick pause to ask you, be honest, if you walked into that room and ran into Elvis looking at you, would you have frozen like the Beatles, or would you have had the guts to say something? Comment down below, what would be the first thing you'd say to the king? I want to see who here has ice in their veins. That phrase was like a spell being broken. Laughter exploded in the room. Suddenly, Elvis was no longer an unreachable deity. He was just a guy wanting to have fun. The barrier between idol and fan crumbled, giving way to a connection between musicians. Elvis asked for guitars to be brought out, and what happened next is the tragedy and glory of that meeting. A historic jam session that was never recorded. No microphones, no tapes, just the room's acoustics and the memory of those present. The musical dynamic that was established was revealing. Paul McCartney, being left-handed, had a comically difficult time trying to handle Elvis's right-handed guitars. But the universal language of rock and roll overcame the logistics. They didn't play Beatles hits nor Elvis's big hits. They went back to common ground, to the roots that fed all their souls. They started playing Chuck Berry classics, R&B songs, and blues. It was a return to the essence. In a moment of pure magic, Elvis stayed on the bass and started accompanying the Beatles' song I Feel Fine. Imagine the scene. The king of rock playing the bass line of a hit by his supposed rivals, showing that he not only knew the music but respected it. Paul McCartney, amazed, praised Elvis's technique on the bass, and there, in that exchange of chords and glances, true communication happened. While strings vibrated and voices harmonized in the center of the room, the surroundings of that meeting revealed equally interesting subplots. Ringo Starr, who always had a unique role in the Beatles' dynamic, ended up drifting away from the musical center at one point. He went to shoot pool with members of the Memphis Mafia. There are amusing and humanizing reports that he complained, with his characteristic humor, when one of the house staff accidentally stepped on his toe. Ringo was there, playing billiards, drinking, and laughing with Elvis's bodyguards, proving that the night was also about male camaraderie and unpretentious fun. However, there was a dark and fascinating contrast happening in another corner of the room far from the music. While the artists created art, the businessmen gambled with fate and money. Colonel Tom Parker, always the opportunistic showman, turned the living room coffee table into an improvised casino roulette. He and Elvis's inner circle began playing against Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager. It is a perfect and almost painful metaphor for the music industry. While John, Paul, George, and Elvis shared a pure moment of creation and mutual admiration, their managers were focused on vice and profit, with reports suggesting Elvis's team cleaned out Epstein's pockets that night. This duality between the purity of music and the coldness of business was the constant backdrop of that historic night, a microcosm of what it was like to live at the top of the entertainment world in 1965. It was around 2 in the morning when the magic of that night began to dissipate, giving way to mundane reality and closing protocols. Colonel Tom Parker, who had orchestrated the event with the precision of a general and the soul of a carnival barker, decided that time was up. The end of the visit was marked by a gesture bordering on surrealism, which today serves as a perfect metaphor for Elvis's career at that time. As a souvenir of that historic night, the Colonel didn't offer jewelry, rare records, or anything of sentimental value. He presented each of the Beatles with a plastic Wild West covered wagon but lit up inside, promotional leftovers from some forgotten project. It was a cheap, almost comical trinket handed to the biggest music stars in the world, a subtle reminder that, for the Colonel, all of that was just another business deal, another exchange of goods in the great bazaar of entertainment. While strings vibrated and voices harmonized in the center of the room, the surroundings of that meeting revealed equally interesting subplots. Ringo Starr, who always had a unique role in the Beatles' dynamic, ended up drifting away from the musical center at one point. He went to shoot pool with members of the Memphis Mafia. There are amusing and humanizing reports that he complained, with his characteristic humor, when one of the house staff accidentally stepped on his toe. Ringo was there, playing billiards, drinking, and laughing with Elvis's bodyguards, proving that the night was also about male camaraderie and unpretentious fun. However, there was a dark and fascinating contrast happening in another corner of the room far from the music. While the artists created art, the businessmen gambled with fate and money. Colonel Tom Parker, always the opportunistic showman, turned the living room coffee table into an improvised casino roulette. He and Elvis's inner circle began playing against Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager. It is a perfect and almost painful metaphor for the music industry. While John, Paul, George, and Elvis shared a pure moment of creation and mutual admiration, their managers were focused on vice and profit, with reports suggesting Elvis's team cleaned out Epstein's pockets that night. This duality between the purity of music and the coldness of business was the constant backdrop of that historic night, a microcosm of what it was like to live at the top of the entertainment world in 1965. It was around 2 in the morning when the magic of that night began to dissipate, giving way to mundane reality and closing protocols. Colonel Tom Parker, who had orchestrated the event with the precision of a general and the soul of a carnival barker, decided that time was up. The end of the visit was marked by a gesture bordering on surrealism, which today serves as a perfect metaphor for Elvis's career at that time. As a souvenir of that historic night, the Colonel didn't offer jewelry, rare records, or anything of sentimental value. He presented each of the Beatles with a plastic Wild West covered wagon but lit up inside, promotional leftovers from some forgotten project. It was a cheap, almost comical trinket handed to the biggest music stars in the world, a subtle reminder that, for the Colonel, all of that was just another business deal, another exchange of goods in the great bazaar of entertainment. The farewell at the mansion door was cordial, with promises of reunions and invitations for Elvis to visit the Beatles at the house where they were staying on Mulholland Drive. There were handshakes, smiles, and that feeling of camaraderie that only exists between those who have shared a moment of artistic vulnerability. However, as soon as the black limousines crossed the gates and disappeared into the darkness of the Bel Air hills, the true nature of that meeting revealed itself, splitting into 2 completely opposite narratives that would define the future of relations between them. For John Lennon, the night had been an almost religious experience. The next day, when Jerry Schilling, one of the closest members of Elvis's entourage, went to visit the Beatles, John pulled him into a corner and confessed, with a sincerity rare for someone so protected by layers of cynicism, that it had been the best night of his life. For the Beatles, the meeting was the final validation. They had not only met the man who inspired them to pick up guitars, but played with him, laughed with him, and were accepted, however briefly, into his sanctuary. They left feeling blessed, with renewed energy and the certainty that the idol was real, human, and still possessed that sacred fire. However, inside the mansion on Perugia Way, the atmosphere was radically different. Elvis Presley's reaction to the closing of the door was cold, pragmatic, and revealing of a deep insecurity he rarely showed the public. When his friends asked what he thought of the lads from Liverpool, Elvis showed no enthusiasm or nostalgia. He simply said he had done his duty, that he had met with them, and that was enough. He made it clear he had no intention of returning the visit or strengthening ties. For Elvis, that wasn't a gathering of friends, it was a territory inspection. This is the part that divides rock historians, and I want to know your opinion. Why do you think Elvis reacted so coldly? Did he really feel threatened by the Beatles' success, or did he just not like their style? Leave your theory in the comments. Let's debate whether this was the king's pride or just him defending his territory. This coldness from Elvis wasn't gratuitous arrogance, but a defense mechanism. He was a man of sharp instincts and realized, perhaps before anyone else, that the Beatles represented a seismic shift in culture that would eventually leave him behind. While Elvis tried to maintain his image as a good American boy, patriotic and polished, the Beatles were about to lead the counterculture revolution with long hair, drug experimentation, and political questioning of the Vietnam War. Elvis felt that by opening the door to them, he was looking at the future, and the future didn't look like him. In the years that followed, this disconnection only deepened. The Beatles tried to maintain contact, sending messages and trying to schedule new meetings, but they were met with the polite and distant silence of Graceland. Mutual admiration turned into a strange unilateral rivalry. Elvis, increasingly isolated and paranoid regarding hippie culture, even came to view the Beatles as a negative and anti-American influence, a bitter irony considering the Beatles were the greatest propagators of Black American music to the white world. The crown of rock and roll, which seemed to have been shared in that living room for a few hours, was, in fact, divided forever. The legacy of that night in 1965 lies precisely in the fact that it never happened again. It was a singular event, an anomaly in time. The fact that no photographs, footage, or audio recordings exist transformed the meeting into a modern myth. If we had a photo of Elvis and Lennon hugging, it would just be a dated image in a history book. But the absence of visual proof forces us to imagine, to fill in the gaps with our own reverence for the music. It was the night the baton was passed, even if Elvis didn't want to let go of it, and the Beatles were too busy creating their own path to hold it. It was the moment classic rock and roll took its last breath of innocence before plunging into the psychedelic complexity of the late 60s. And so, the door closed, the lights went out, and the two greatest giants of music followed parallel paths that would never cross again, leaving behind only the echo of laughter and bass chords in a dark room in Bel Air. This story leaves us with many questions, but with only one absolute certainty. There never was and never will be another Elvis Presley. That meeting in 1965 was just a chapter in the legend of a man who changed the world with a guitar and a dream.
Now, I want to hear your voice from fan to fan. What would you do if you were in that room? Do you think Elvis was right to keep his distance, or did he lose the chance to form a historic partnership with the Beatles? Write your theory down below in the comments. I read everything, and I want to know what the true rock family thinks. If this deep dive into music history was worth your time today, hit that like button. It's a quick gesture for you, but it shows YouTube that the King's legacy remains alive and strong and helps us bring more documentaries like this one. And if you're not part of our tribe yet, don't waste time. Click that subscribe button, and most importantly, activate the notification bell. Here we follow the King's motto, TCB, taking care of business. We take the mission of keeping these memories alive seriously. Do you have a friend, an uncle, or someone in the family who loves Elvis or the Beatles? Copy the link and send this video to them right now via text or WhatsApp. Let's spread this story that almost got forgotten in time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I am your name or channel name, and remember, the King might have left the building, but the music never dies. Until next time, everyone, TCB.